Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Let's Remember Suikoden 3. We are playing as Hugo. We are on our way to deliver a message to the council in Zexay. We have to stop at Brass Castle on the way, and we sort of know what happens here. Good news! I found a controller where I can actually use the stick instead of the dreaded D-pad. I don't know why the other controller wasn't working, but hey, that's an exciting little bit of stuff that happened. So let's dive back into it. I was a little rambly last time. I hope I'm a little bit more focused. So let's talk about heading into Brass Castle and sort of the stuff that it entails. A couple things are useful about Hugo's lack of experience compared to Sergeant Joe's general sense of experience. And it's definitely that whole matter of having a POV character that isn't as knowledgeable about the wider world, so every now and then the game can sneak exposition into the game under the guise of Hugo not knowing something. This isn't necessarily an example of that. They're just looking at a council and being like, oh my gosh, this is really big. Did I say council or castle? I don't know. Rewind and find out for yourself. But it's very clear that Hugo is entering into a space now that he does not understand. Which is a little different because even when Chris enters the grasslands, she has some understanding of the grasslands because she has fought there, right? Every character we have control over has varying degrees of knowledge of the area. Ghetto has the most because he has, excuse me, the most sort of direct connections to everybody. Hugo understands the grasslands. Zexay is Chris's territory, but Chris still has wider knowledge. Hugo's the one who doesn't really know as much. Just to stress the point that we made before about economics in Chris's chapter, we can see that I have not a lot of cash. I have a little over 1,500, whereas Chris had like almost 200,000, which is really something. So just small things like that within our menus can tell us also about sort of where characters fall in the grander social strata of the game space, not just where they fall within their respective cultures, but also where they fall in sort of the wider world itself. Economics in games can be a powerful tool for contextualizing what we sort of need to know about characters. In this case, Hugo has set off, and he really only has his companions to guide him, right? He doesn't have the resources that Chris does, or even Ghetto. So here, we've seen this scene as Chris, and the interesting thing here, and forgive me for every time I say interesting, because if you took a shot every time I said interesting, you certainly would not be standing up throughout any of these playthroughs. The interesting thing about this scene is that because we have seen it before, the context of the scene changes based upon who our main actor is at the time. So here, when we saw this scene initially, it really was more about Chris and the gender politics between her and her knights, particularly once Roland steps in here. Right? And it became more about Chris's relationship with the soldiers under her command, rather than her attitudes towards Hugo or members of the grasslands. Chris herself handles things here rather nicely. So does Louis, right? But when Roland comes in, the conversation changes from what it was in the chapter when we had observed it before, and it becomes far, far more about the racial and ethnic politics that are going on, which is complicated only by the fact that Roland is an elf. But everything within this scene, the way it's framed, is sort of telling us about the power dynamics of the space, right? We have Roland high on his horse looking down. We have this sort of behind the back shot of Hugo. Hugo is smaller than everybody, not just because they're mounted, but Hugo is younger. His companions are smaller, with the exception of Fubar. It's Lulu and Sergeant Joe. Sergeant Joe, as competent as he might be, a small duck. There's this very big contrast between Hugo's group and Chris's group, and it really stresses the power dynamics of the space. And regardless of how much Chris might apologize, or how much Louis will apologize to Lulu, this moment of Roland talking to us here and telling us, like we sort of saw before, we decide who lives and who speaks and all of that. Seeing it from Hugo's perspective changes things. It doesn't radically change things, but it does draw into focus certain things within the conversation that maybe weren't our concern to begin with. Right? Maybe when we were playing as Chris, the thing that we weren't concerned with was, we were sort of concerned with attitudes between Zexan and Grasslanders, but that wasn't the main focus. We were sort of interested in what the exchanges that were taking place said about Chris's place in the world. Now we have a greater understanding of where Hugo fits into the world, and that's something that really only comes about when we are controlling multiple actors. They allow us to experience sometimes scenes in different contexts, certainly spaces in different contexts, and all of those contexts vary. And the socio-political context change, the economics sort of change. And so that's one of the great things about having multiple protagonists, even though this is something, I forget if I've noted before, that the games didn't really do after this, and not many games tend to do, because having a player split their focus between multiple actors risks, or at least I think the general assumption is that it risks sort of partitioning their general empathy, right? So you want players to have empathy for the actors that they control. And one of the ways you do that is just sort of by having a main protagonist, in many cases a protagonist that you can name, and just having them, and sort of saying, well, here's the main character, and you will find value in the main character via some sort of projection onto that character, and that's that. Whereas Suikoden 3 says, no, hold on, we're going to use multiple points of view and have 3 interesting protagonists, all with different sort of flaws and backgrounds. And we trust the player enough to be able to juggle their feelings, their continually shifting and complicated feelings about these characters. You'll notice also that Hugo is riding Fubar. If you put them together in the same formation, you can actually use Fubar as your mount in combat, which is a very nice touch, and turns Hugo and Fubar into a really ridiculously strong combination to use, particularly early in the game. Oh, I was like, I thought we did it. No, there's still one little shrub. Caca! Boom, took care of it. I suppose my broader point is that by having all of these actors from different backgrounds, we get to experience scenes in different meaningful ways, but we also get to experience spaces in different meaningful ways, right? So when I get to Zexan and I'm playing as Hugo, my engagements in Zexan, my interactions in Zexan, they don't mechanically change, right? I have all the same modes of interaction available to me as Chris. I can walk around, I can talk to people, I can go to stores. But the thing that shifts, for instance, let's talk about stores, is that if I'm playing as Chris, I can walk into a store, I can buy whatever I want. I can go up to a trainer, I can pay and upgrade my character stats pretty much as I want. I can upgrade my weapons. Hugo, I can't do that, and so my engagement with spaces change. in the sense that while I still have the same modes of interaction, basically, navigating a menu and upgrading items, what I don't have are the same benefits or privileges that Chris does in her space. And even knowing that, we know that Chris struggles in that space because she is not always respected in the space that she's in. So our understanding of a space like Zexin, both as a game space and as sort of a fictional location, grows and develops a certain degree of complexity that you don't get if you're just playing as a single character. It's not always something that will happen in the context of stores, but it can. So another example of this is if in Final Fantasy VI, Edgar is my party leader and I go to shop in Figaro Castle, the people of the castle will actually try to not let me pay. They'll be like, "You're the king, you shouldn't have to pay," and Edgar says, "Listen, I will pay because I have the money and I want to make sure that my citizens thrive." And eventually what happens is that you settle on a 50% discount. So it's not common to see economic shifts change necessarily. And in this game, all that's really changing is how much money you start with, but that still says something. But those economic factors can occur in games. Obviously, you can sort of buck the trend within those systems by exploiting certain things, including grinding. And then I know earlier on, if you look at the map, we can actually go to the Duck Village if we had wanted to earlier on. There's actually a lottery there, and if you're really, really lucky, you can get 500,000 gold. Well, they call it Poch in this game, but it's gold. And that sort of changes things a lot if we're just talking about the economics that are sort of expressed ludicrously by the amount, just the raw statistical amount of money that my character holds. So now we get to enter into Zexin, and people don't treat me radically different, right? But the way that I'm treated in the space does change to an extent, and I don't feel as comfortable in this space as I do as Ghetto or as Chris for multiple reasons. And some of that even ties back into something as simple as Hugo's age. Like, say I was playing as Jimba for whatever reason. I don't feel as disadvantaged in Zexin because I am an adult. Hugo is not an adult yet. He's sort of right on the edge of being considered an adult by his tribe, which is why he has to take up this duty as the chief's son. Whatever vague sense of anxiety I feel while I am in Zexin changes based upon the sort of facticities of my character. And one of those facticities is not just the fact that Hugo is of a different ethnic group, but also the fact that Hugo is, like, younger and Hugo doesn't have as much knowledge, right? Like, all of these things add together to make my engagement with the space, to make my engagement with Zexin, different than the engagements that I previously had as Chris or as Ghetto. In particular, this contrast is something that you can notice a lot anytime you enter into a space as Ghetto, and then you enter into it as Chris or Hugo. We sort of said it before, Ghetto has this advantage of being able to sort of shift chameleon-like into any space. Hugo and Chris don't have that. And so by giving Ghetto that sort of ability to blend in and adapt, we get to see the ways in which Hugo and Chris are outliers when they're in certain areas. Which is another reason why Ghetto can be seen as a valuable addition to the game, particularly in the early chapters before his story really gets going. He just serves to provide larger context for the spaces that we enter as Hugo and Chris. And it's also reflected in the way that our characters behave and comment upon the space. So it's like Sergeant Joe's like, I cannot wait to get out of here. He's like, sea breeze is weird, and I'd rather be out in the fields, and all of this stuff, right? So this only, like, we could have the characters just say that, right? And that tells us about the space. It tells us about their feelings, all sorts of things. But the game smartly goes out of its way to use the contrasting viewpoints to not only give the spaces a variety of different contexts, but also lets us see what happens when somebody who is generally comfortable in a space walks through it, compared to when somebody who is uncomfortable in that space, compared to somebody who is almost completely foreign to that space. Those are all three different ways of being in a place. And we get to experience all of them, which then helps us understand or develop a holistic opinion about the game world. We are dropping off to the Lightfellow estate to give the crest, the pentacle that Jimba gave us. And it's a quiet moment. It's something that we'll understand the significance of a little bit more later on. This will mark an interesting thing that I want to note about how the sort of Trinity site system 3 POV thing works, and it's that I think that if I had come here and played Hugo's chapter first and dropped this off, the butler would have commented about it in Chris's chapter. You know, a flag would have been switched from on to off, you know, and that would have just played a little bit of extra dialogue near the end of Chris's chapter when she's with the butler. This does happen in other cases. Also, he's asking if I want a reward. The first two make sense. Asking flat out for money, vague, only in character in the vaguest sense. But we'll say that it was a favor from Jimba because we want Hugo to be generally playing into the standard JRPG hero tropes that I was talking about in the last segment, because a lot of what happens in Vinay del Zexay and the rest of the chapter is about innocence, and then sort of losing that innocence, or what happens when the things that we sort of treated idealistically are presented right before us in all their stark reality and sort of ugliness. Which is, we'll get there when we get there, but there are parts about this engagement in Vinay del Zexay that I do not like, because it feels a little bit like filler, considering how quickly Ghetto and Chris's chapters tend to handle the sort of meatier politics. Oh wow, that bird was like solid. I could barely run through it. So here we get to go and try and talk to the council. And there's some fun stuff here where they don't understand that the guard doesn't talk, which is another way of expressing just how foreign, like, to the outside observer, Hugo is the foreign one in this space, right? He doesn't necessarily belong, but the notion of this guard that just stands there, it's like Lulu and the other folk, Joe and Hugo, they don't get it. They don't understand, like, this weird code. Like, it's not really a code, but it's just like, it's not quite anachronistic, right? Because within the setting it still makes sense, but it is this thing where it's like, for them it's just very odd. And it speaks to something that I think is very interesting about the setting, and it's that even the smallest characters, like this Marshal here, can potentially have really big consequences for the game itself. Now, it seems like he's not going to let them enter, and I'm going to spoil it. Yeah, they get to at least go inside. But let's hypothetically say that the reason that Chris couldn't contact the council, or excuse me, Hugo couldn't contact the council, was because this marshal just didn't let him in. This is a game series where even the smallest players can have a really big impact. So one thing I really like about this series is that for want of a nail, a kingdom can be lost. And you really get a sense of that. You know, Sergeant Joe's going to say this, hey, you know, we're here on official business, we need to speak to the council. And the marshal's like, do you have any proof? Like, you're just coming up to me. In some weird alternate version of this scenario, they don't let them in. And, I mean, shit's still going to break bad no matter what, but it's like, I imagine that it is possible for a nameless character to have impact in the spaces and the structures of a Suikoden game. Because even though the 108 Stars of Destiny are like the characters that we all really care about, and the ones that are tied to the plot, or at least they're the ones we recruit, and that's sort of interesting. The settings feel rich enough that even a random NPC could affect things in a fairly significant way. And that's enjoyable. You don't always get a sense of that in other games. Sometimes NPCs just sort of feel placed there on a map so you can get a little bit of flavor text from them, and that's it. In Suikoden, the characters from, you know, the controllable actor all the way down to the most modest background character all seem like they have the ability to affect the plot. In this case, the council just doesn't agree to listen to Hugo, or at least they delay a meeting for 2 to 3 days, they say. So it's 2 to 3 days of Hugo just being stuck in Vinay del Zexay. Which is just this other thing of like, if there was some way that Hugo could have talked to Chris, or Hugo could have talked to the council, or somehow Ghetto was around to talk to Jimba about more things. Like, I don't know, there are all these little missed moments of connection where a lot of what happens could have been avoided, or at least it seems like it could be avoided. But, you know, the plot is being manipulated by outside forces that sort of make sure that the lack of commonality between these people leads to violence. But you get the sense that this is a world where it's also, the conflict at hand is not just something that is just the fault of some evil Machiavellian villain. That was weird to say, Machiavellian villain. Even though that is sort of the state of affairs that's happening, you also get the sense that this conflict could have occurred organically and naturally in one form or another, based upon the actions of plenty of people. I need to walk over here to trigger a scene. So we'll end this chapter, or this video very soon, but we're going to enter into sort of a strange side section for Hugo's chapter. This is Guillaume. He's kind of a jerk. You get to duel him a couple times in the game, I believe. Dueling is something that I may or may not be able to show off in Hugo's chapter. I might have locked myself out of it because I already played Chris's chapter, because there is a dialogue option that lets you, in Hugo's chapter, duel Chris, but I don't think you are able to do so if you've already played Chris's chapter, because it sort of pre-chooses the dialogue that's already occurred. It doesn't do a Rashomon thing where it's like, no, this is what actually happened, this is what this person said. It's once somebody has said something within the context of the game, like, that's triggered, and that's sort of what's happened. So I don't know if I'll have dialogue options when I get to the Caria village incident with Hugo. So Guillaume's just being a butt to Melville here, talking about his dad who ran off searching for some sort of ghost ship. This stuff is sort of the stuff that would happen in, like, a cartoon where they're just trying to fill time for like to get another episode for the season. And I will stop after this, but what's going on, I just want to talk about this for a minute. This game, the series can be pretty bad about it, but also there can just be some poor conveyance in this game as well, where what happens is I need to find Alanis and Elliot, and if I run here, I'm going to be like, hey, running through NPCs. If I run really fast, I might not see her, but she's right there, and also she's being obscured by an NPC, and I might be forgiven for not seeing her and having to run around the city, and it's a whole lot of stuff, and it's really, really bad, and it's one of the things that I don't like about this game. And then also, I don't think I mentioned it, or if I did, I'll repeat it, the translation can be pretty bad. Not terrible, just a little bad. So we're going to trigger this scene here, and then we will continue on from this. So Elliot is meeting up with Alanis. Melville is all bummed out about his father. It seems like a side story thing, and to an extent it is, but in the next video I'll try and explain why I think that the interactions with Elliot, Alanis, and Melville are important for Hugo's chapter. And again, it largely has to do with the theme of innocence. These are children who like to play make-believe about being soldiers and things like that, and we are going to have to deal with the reality of what war actually is, and indeed we have in previous chapters already. So for instance, Alanis, Silver Maiden, and sub-captain of the St. Loa Knights, I apologize for coming late. They sort of play that make-believe game, and so we'll talk about what that make-believe stuff means in the context of the story, and why Hugo is interacting with these characters in a more comprehensive way than any other controllable actor that we've had thus far. Elliot's really bad at passwords. He just said it out loud in the middle of a street, and so we are going to be able to visit them in the next segment. They are going to run off. There is a back alley where they have a little hideout, and we'll go from there. Yeah, it's really interesting to re-engage with these spaces as a different character. It's much more charged being in the space than it was sort of vaguely passing through it as Ghetto. And so the one takeaway I hope that we get from this segment is that the changing point of views not only allow us to see the contrasts and differences between the characters, but they also actually allow more comprehensive and complete look at the game spaces that we're in, and how they function sort of from an in-game perspective, and how they function as game structures. And I wish that more games would sort of experiment with point of view. And certainly there are plenty of games out there that do it, but I think that JRPGs are really good vessels for storytelling. RPGs in general are great vessels for storytelling, and I think they don't take advantage of the notion of point of view as effectively as they could. I think Suikoden 3 is a good example of how it works to the game's benefit. So that is that. I will see you all in the next segment. I love you very, very much. You are amazing, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, or night, or evening, or morning, or whatever. Thank you very much for watching. Bye!